The Duke married his late friend's spinster sister, but then he refused to let her go England, had a way of burying things quietly. A man could die in Portugal, far from home, in the mud and smoke of a war that nobody in the drawing rooms of London truly wanted to think about too carefully. And within 6 months, the world that knew him would carry on almost exactly as before. The clocks would tick, the seasons would turn, the same families would sit at the same dinner tables and eat the same roasted lamb and talk about the same things: the weather, the roads, who had married whom, who was ruined, who had come into money. Life had a particular talent for smoothing over its own wounds, filling them in with small, ordinary hours, until the shape of the absence was the only thing left, and even that faded eventually, the way a bruise fades, color by color, until you have to press quite hard to feel that anything was ever there at all. Captain Robert Vane died on a Tuesday in October. The letter arrived at Crail House 3 weeks later, stiff with official wording, polite in the way that official wording always is when it is trying to soften the unsoftenable. Edmund Ashford, the 8th Duke of Crail, read it standing in his study with his coat still on, because the footman had handed it to him in the hall, and he had walked through 2 rooms before opening it without being fully aware of doing so. He read it once. Then he read it again, in case the words rearranged themselves the second time. They did not. He folded the letter, put it in his coat pocket, against his chest, walked to the window and stood there for a long time looking at the garden below, the late roses still hanging on despite the cold, the gravel wet and dark from the morning's rain. He did not call for his valet. He did not go to dinner. The kitchen sent up a tray at 9 o'clock, and it sat outside the study door and nobody touched it. Robert Vane had been Edmund's oldest friend, not the closest, not the most comfortable, but the oldest, in the way that 2 boys who grew up in adjacent counties and went to the same school at 7 and shared the particular misery of being small and cold and far from home together, that kind of old. The kind that is less a friendship than a fact of your life, like the house you grew up in. You don't choose it, it is simply there, and when it is gone, there is no replacing it, because it was never something you could have built twice. It was made from particular years, particular classrooms, a particular broken window in the East Dormitory, that both boys had climbed through on separate occasions and never mentioned to each other directly. Edmund was 33 years old. He had survived the war from the inside of Whitehall, which meant he had survived it differently from Robert, with paperwork and strategy and the distant understanding of things, rather than the mud. This fact had sat between them like a third person at every meal since Edmund had taken his seat in the Lords. Robert had never said a word about it. That was the worst part. Robert had never said a word about it at all, which meant Edmund had to carry the unsaid thing himself, turning it over and over until it was worn smooth. And now Robert was dead, and the unsaid thing would never be said, and Edmund was 33 years old and standing at a window in October with his coat still on. He found the other letter 11 days later, not the official one, a second one, tucked inside the same packet, smaller, on cheaper paper, clearly written in some haste, the ink uneven, the hand less steady than Edmund remembered it being. A letter Robert had written himself, addressed not to the War Office but directly to Edmund. It must have been sent separately, through a private messenger, arriving with the official notice by some coincidence of timing that felt, to Edmund, less like a coincidence and more like something Robert had arranged on purpose. Robert had always been good at arranging things. The letter was not long. It said what it needed to say and stopped. Robert had never been a man who used 3 words where one would do. He wrote about the war briefly, not about the fighting but about the light in the mornings, which he said was different from English light in a way he could not quite pin down, warmer or colder or simply more present, he wasn't sure. He wrote about a dog he had befriended near the camp, a thin brown thing with one ear that had taken to sleeping outside his tent. He wrote about how much he missed a particular kind of bread that his mother used to have made. Then, in the last third of the letter, he wrote about his sister. Harriet Vane was 28 years old, the letter said. She had been 28 for 2 years, and the world had been, in those 2 years, making certain calculations about her that Robert found both irritating and quietly frightening. She was not, in the opinion of the world that made these calculations, likely to marry. She had missed the narrow window, too particular, too sharp, too unwilling to smile at the right moments. And now she was living in the family house in Lincolnshire, on the income from what Robert delicately called a modest arrangement their father had left, which in practical terms meant just enough not to be desperate and not quite enough for anything else. Their mother was dead. Their father was dead. There were no other brothers. When Robert was also gone, there would be nobody. He did not say, "I am asking you to marry her." He was too careful for that. He knew Edmund well enough to know that a direct request made in the conditional tense from a dying man was the kind of thing that could build a cage around a person, and Robert had loved Edmund too much to cage him. So he said, instead, what he said, which was this. He thought about her every morning. He thought about what would happen to her. He thought that if there was anyone in the world he trusted with the keeping of her, it was Edmund, and not because Edmund was particularly good at keeping things, but because Edmund was. Robert used this word carefully. He must have. It was too precisely placed to be accidental. Decent. Decent. Not brilliant. Not kind. Not generous. Decent. Edmund read the word 4 times. Then he folded the letter, put it in his coat pocket beside the official one, and stood in his study for a while doing nothing at all. On the 12th day, he called for his horse. He rode to Lincolnshire. It took 2 days, through countryside that was shedding its autumn in great slow sheets of yellow and brown, the road soft under the horse's hooves, the sky low and white. Edmund did not think, during those 2 days, about what he was going to say. He had made his decision already. It had been made, really, the moment he read Robert's letter, and the decision was a kind of wall he had built around the question, so that he didn't have to look at it directly. He was going to go. He was going to offer. That was all. Everything else was details. The Vane house was smaller than he remembered from the one time he had visited, years ago, as a young man. A square gray stone house at the end of a long flat drive. The garden slightly overgrown in the particular way of houses where the gardener has been reduced from 3 to 1 and nobody talks about it. He arrived in the late afternoon. The sky had gone the color of pewter, and the wind was coming off the flat Lincolnshire fields in long, cold pulls. He dismounted and handed his horse to the boy who came around from the stables, a child of maybe 12 who looked at the horse with uncomplicated love. And then he saw her. She was in the garden, not the front garden, the side garden, visible through a gap in the low hedge, where a series of beds had been planted with what appeared to be a rather scientific thoroughness, each plant labeled with a small wooden marker. She had her back to him, and she was doing something to a rose bush with a pair of shears, cutting it back with the focused precision of someone who is not gardening for pleasure, but for the specific comfort of having something to do with her hands. She had a gray wool coat on, and her dark hair was pulled up but falling slightly at the back, and she was entirely absorbed. He stood at the gap in the hedge for a moment. Then she turned. She did not scream. She did not drop the shears. She simply looked at him in the clear, measuring way of someone who has not had enough surprises to have kept her startled face in working order, and said, "Lord Crail," just those 2 words, very flat. He bowed, said her name. She looked at him for another second, then at the house, then back at him. She was, he noticed, not going to make anything easy for him. He had forgotten that about her. The one time he had met her, years ago, she had been a girl at her brother's shoulder, half in the conversation and half not, saying very little, but somehow making the room aware of her presence in a way he couldn't fully explain. He hadn't thought about her since, but he noticed now, standing at the gap in the hedge, that she had grown into a person with a great deal of gravity, the kind of gravity that is not performance, the kind that is simply a fact of how a person occupies space. He told her he had come to speak with her. She showed him inside. They sat in the parlor, which was clean and cold, the fire built small in the way of people managing their coal. There was tea. There were biscuits that she had clearly not baked herself, from the slightly lopsided way they sat in the tin, and he liked her for having bought them rather than pretended otherwise. She sat across from him with her hands in her lap, and waited. He told her about the letter, Robert's letter. Her face did not change. She looked at the window for a moment, then back at him. He told her what Robert had asked, not word for word. That felt wrong, too much like invoking a ghost as a weapon, but the shape of it. He told her that Robert had worried about her, that Robert had thought, in his last months, about what would happen, that Robert had, and this was where Edmund chose his words with particular care, suggested, not commanded, that Edmund might consider whether a formal arrangement between them could be mutually beneficial. He did not say, "I am here because he asked." He did not say, "This is a favor, or a duty, or a debt." He said, "I am here because I thought it was worth asking. The decision is entirely yours." Harriet Vane looked at him for a long time. He could not tell, from looking at her, what she was thinking. Her face was not blank. It was full, in fact, of something working under the surface. But whatever it was, she had control of it entirely. He thought of the rosebush, the shears, the focused, contained quality of her in the garden. She asked one question. She asked, what did he want from it? Not what she would get. She was practical enough to understand the calculation of that already. A duke's name, a duke's house, a duke's income. These were not small things. She wanted to know what he would want. He said he wanted to honor what Robert had asked, without trapping either of them in something they would both regret. He said he would expect nothing from her that she was not willing to give. He said he understood that this was not the arrangement either of them would have chosen, and he would not pretend otherwise. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said yes. Not warmly, not with relief. She said it the way a person says yes to something they have decided in advance they are going to do, not because they want it, but because refusing feels like a larger defeat than accepting. He recognized the shape of that kind of yes. He had given a few of those himself. They were married 6 weeks later in a small church near the estate, with a dozen people watching. It was a gray November morning. The church smelled of cold stone and candle wax. The vicar was old and spoke the words in the careful, slightly mechanical way of a man who has said them so many times he has to remind himself what they mean. Edmund said his vows steadily and quietly, looking at her. She said hers, looking somewhere just past his left shoulder, which he noted and did not comment on. Afterward, in the carriage back to Crail, he told her how things would be. He told her gently, choosing his words the way a man lays out a legal document. Clearly, without room for misunderstanding. She would have the east wing. He would have the west. She was welcome in all the common rooms of the house, and at all the common meals, and he would expect her to be present at the dinners they were obliged to host and the visits they were obliged to make, because a duke's household required a duchess, and he was not going to ask her to hide. Beyond that, she would have complete freedom. The house, the grounds, the library, all of it was at her disposal. He would not intrude on her time or her space. He told her he did not expect love from her. He thought, given her situation and her age, she had probably arrived at a sensible view of the subject already. He had none left to give in any case. He looked at the countryside going past the carriage window as he said this last part. Harriet Vane looked at the opposite wall. There was a small ceramic vase on a shelf beside the carriage door, fixed there for decoration. She looked at it for a moment. Then she reached out and moved it exactly 2 inches to the left, so that it sat precisely centered on its little bracket. Then she took her hand back. He watched her do this, and did not say anything. She said, "Fine." That was all. Fine. The carriage rolled on through the November afternoon. Crail House was everything a duke's house ought to be, and slightly more than Edmund had ever felt comfortable in. Large and old, and full of the particular cold that large old houses contain, even when they are warm, as if the stones remember all the winters they've held and cannot quite warm all the way through. The staff were in the entrance hall when they arrived. Edmund introduced her. The housekeeper, Mrs. Alderton, who had been at Crail for 30 years and had opinions about everything, but shared them only with the cook, took one look at the new Duchess and made a series of quiet internal calculations that she kept entirely to herself. Harriet thanked everyone by name, having memorized the names from the list Edmund Stewart had sent her before the wedding. Edmund noticed this. He didn't think she knew he noticed. She moved into the east wing. She organized it within 2 days. Not with fuss, but with the thoroughness of someone who needs to know exactly where everything is before they can settle. She rearranged the small writing desk so that the light from the window fell on it at the correct angle. She took the decorative rug out of her sitting room and replaced it with a plain one from the store cupboard. She put her books, a significant number, more than the butler had anticipated, requiring 3 trips, on the shelves, and arranged them in a system that was not alphabetical, but that made sense to her. Edmund walked past the east wing door twice on the second evening, and then went to his own rooms without knocking. They had dinner together. He had arranged the table so that they sat at reasonable proximity, not the full absurd length of the formal dining room, which could have seated 20, and felt, for 2 people, like talking across a field. They used the smaller dining room. Dinner, the first night, was largely quiet. Not uncomfortable. There was food, there was wine. There were the small practical exchanges of 2 people establishing habits. She asked about the estate, he told her. She asked a specific question about the crop rotation on the north field, which was precise enough that he looked at her for a moment before answering. She had been reading, apparently, the estate ledgers which he had left in the library. She had read them in the 2 days before dinner. He told her about the north field. She listened, and then said something about the drainage that was not wrong. He looked at her for another moment. She was eating her soup with complete composure. He said nothing, but something in him rearranged itself, slightly, the way the vase had rearranged itself in the carriage. He was not sure, lying awake that night in the West Wing, what to do with this information, that his wife was someone who read estate ledgers for pleasure and was right about drainage. He decided to do nothing with it. This lasted about 3 weeks. The thing about a shared house is that it is very bad at respecting the walls you try to build inside it. You intend to be in your wing. You end up in the library. You intend to come in late from the stables. She is already there, at the writing desk with the correct light, composing a letter, and there is nowhere to go but in. So you go in, and you say something neutral about the weather, and she says something equally neutral back, and somehow you are both in the room, and neither of you is leaving. It happened like this, gradually, over weeks. Not in great moments, but in small ones. The kind of moments you don't notice are accumulating until you look back and they are already built into the architecture of your day. Edmund found himself in the East Wing sitting room more often than he had planned. Not because he was looking for her. He told himself this, and it was even partly true, but because the house had a rhythm now that it hadn't had before. A particular shape to the mornings and evenings, and that shape had her in it. She was always in the middle of something, never idle. She had introduced herself to the kitchen garden within the first week, and was conducting some kind of quiet campaign to restore it to a previous state of productivity that it had apparently drifted from under the last head gardener. She had begun corresponding with someone in Edinburgh about seeds. She had found, in the library, a collection of natural history texts that the previous Duke had apparently purchased and never opened, and she was working through them with the focused pleasure of someone who has just discovered an entire country they didn't know was there. She argued, one Tuesday morning at 7:30, with the estate manager about the winter wheat. Edmund came into his own breakfast room to find them both standing near the window. The estate manager, a solid, experienced man of 50, who had managed Crail for 12 years and had very precise opinions about things, looking at the Duchess with the expression of someone who is encountering a force of nature for the first time and is still determining whether to yield or brace. She was explaining, with complete composure and a series of very specific references to a farming almanac she was holding, that the field currently designated for winter wheat would produce significantly better results if planted 2 weeks earlier and with a modified seed depth. The estate manager looked at Edmund. Edmund looked at the almanac. He said, "She might be right. Look into it." The estate manager looked back at the Duchess. Then he nodded, with the particular nod of a man who has decided this is not the fight he is going to die on. Harriet thanked him without triumph, which Edmund thought showed exceptional self-restraint, because she was clearly right and they all knew it. He poured his own tea. She was already pouring hers. He said, "Do you always begin your arguments with primary sources?" She said, "I find it saves time." He laughed. It was a small laugh, the contained kind, barely a sound, but it was there, and she looked up at him when she heard it, and there was something in her face for a moment, not quite surprise, but close to it, the way someone looks when a door they thought was painted shut opens slightly under their hand. Then she looked back at her tea. He looked back at his. The mornings after that had a different quality. Not warmer exactly. He was careful. He was always careful. He had decided on civility, and he was going to honor what he had decided. But there was a texture to them that hadn't been there before. The small arguments, the references, the way she would say something dry and precise, at exactly the moment he had been thinking the same thing, which was disconcerting in a way he didn't examine too carefully. He examined very little of it too carefully. He had learned, in the years since he was 27, and had made a particular series of decisions about what he did and did not deserve from his life, to be disciplined about where he looked inside himself. Some rooms you leave closed. You know what's in them. You don't go in. But December came. And with December came the winter entertainments, and the winter entertainments required a duchess, and the duchess was very good at being a duchess in a way he had not expected and had not planned for. She was not warm at dinner parties. She did not perform. She did not fill the room the way some women could, with a kind of bright, effortful social light. What she did was listen, genuinely listen, with the full weight of her attention, and then say one precise, interesting thing that made whoever she was talking to feel they had said something worth listening to. It was a very particular skill, and it was not taught. It was simply how she was. Lord and Lady Ashby, who came for 3 days in mid-December and who had been known to be difficult guests since a disastrous house party in the summer of 1814 that nobody talked about directly, left in an excellent mood. Lady Ashby told 3 separate people the following week that the new Duchess of Crail was remarkable. Edmund heard this through the particular telegraph of country society that transmits information in all directions at once. He thought about it for longer than he should have. He started finding reasons to be in the South Gallery after dinner, because the South Gallery was where she walked when she couldn't sleep, following a habit she had established in the first week without telling anyone. He knew she did this because he had heard the footsteps once, looked out his study door, and seen her moving down the corridor with a candle, very quiet, very steady, like a woman who has made peace with her own sleeplessness. He had watched until she turned the corner and then gone back to his desk. He did not go to the South Gallery for 3 weeks after that. Then he did. He told himself he wanted a book from the shelves there. He had taken the book and was standing by the window looking at the frozen garden below when she appeared at the far end with her candle. She stopped when she saw him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. She said, "I didn't know you walked at night." He said, "I don't, usually." She looked at the book in his hand. He looked at the book in his hand. He had picked it at random, and it turned out, a collected anthology of Portuguese poetry, which he could not read. He put it back. She walked to the window at her end of the gallery and stood looking at the garden from there. They were perhaps 30 feet apart. The house was very quiet around them, the way old houses are at night, full of settled dark. She said, without turning, "Do you think he knew, when he wrote the letter, that it would happen this way?" He didn't ask which letter. He knew. He thought about Robert, the particular brightness of him, the way he had always seen sideways into things, noticed what other people missed. He said, "Yes." She didn't answer for a while. Then she said, "He was infuriating." He said, "Yes." He heard her exhale. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, somewhere in between, a sound of complicated affection for a person who was no longer there to be complicated about. He knew that sound. He had made it himself, in private, several times. He said, "He told me you were sharp-tongued and particular and unlikely to suffer fools." She turned. In the candlelight her face was unguarded in a way it usually wasn't. She said, "He told me you were the most stubborn person he had ever met, and that this was the reason he trusted you." Edmund looked at the frozen garden. He said, "He wasn't wrong." She said, "No." They stood there in the South Gallery for a while longer, not talking, not needing to. The candle she was holding was getting low. When it guttered, she said good night, and went back the way she had come, and he stood by the window a little longer, and then went back to the west wing and lay in the dark for a long time with his eyes open. He did not name the thing. He was exceptionally good at not naming things. January was cold and blue and very still. The estate settled into its winter quiet. The social obligations paused, and there were weeks when they saw almost no one but each other, which Edmund had anticipated being tolerable and found was something else entirely, though he did not examine that too carefully either. She had taken over the correspondence with the Scottish seed supplier entirely and was now writing to someone in Cornwall about apple trees. She had a project, she told him one afternoon when he asked, to restore the orchard behind the east kitchen garden to something like its original state, which she had found documented in a household inventory from 1743. She showed him the inventory. It listed 47 different varieties of apple, some of which no longer existed. She was trying to find substitutes. He looked at the list of 47 apple varieties. He looked at her. He said, "You found this in the household inventory." She said, "There are 63 years of inventories in the muniments room. I've been reading them." He said, "You've been reading 63 years of household inventories." She said, "They're very informative. Your great-grandfather had 7 cats." He said, "I know about the cats." She said, "Did you know he named them all after Roman senators?" He did not know that. He sat down at the table across from her, and she passed him the 1743 inventory, and he read it, or tried to, because his great-grandfather had written in a hand like a spider recovering from a fall, and they spent the better part of an hour working through it together, her translating the worst passages and him occasionally recognizing a word and feeling unreasonably pleased about it. He was home, he thought. He was sitting in his own house with his wife, deciphering his great-grandfather's handwriting and feeling more like himself than he had in 2 years. The thought arrived with the flat certainty of something that has been true for a while and has simply waited for you to notice. He put the inventory down. She was making a note of something in her own notebook, bent over the page with her particular concentrated look, the small vertical line between her brows that appeared when she was working. She did not look up. He looked at the window. The window. Then he said he had letters to write, excused himself, and went to the West Wing. He sat at his desk for an hour without writing anything. He was afraid. Not of her. Not precisely. He was afraid in the way a man is afraid who has built a careful structure and then noticed that it is leaning. He had constructed things very deliberately. The arrangement, the civility, the East Wing and the West Wing and the agreement between them, unstated but understood, that this was a practical thing and not a real thing, and that both of them would be safe inside that understanding. But the South Gallery in December. But the breakfast table in November, with the farming almanac. But 47 apple varieties, and the 6-censored certainty that wherever she was in the house, he knew. He had told Robert he would keep her. He had told himself that was the whole of it. February arrived, and with it a letter from a solicitor in Edinburgh. The letter concerned a distant cousin of Edmund's, a woman, never married, who had died at 82 in her cottage in the Borders, leaving behind a small amount of money and the cottage itself, and a will that specified these should pass to the nearest unmarried female Ashford of good standing, to provide for her in the event that the family had not done so already. The solicitor was writing to advise that with Edmund's recent marriage, his wife was the relevant party, and that while the bequest was modest, the cottage especially so, though habitable, it was legally hers if she wanted it, and if she wished to contest the marriage on grounds of arrangement and claim independent standing, there were provisions in the will that might support this. Edmund read the letter twice. He sat with it for 3 days. Then he went and found her in the kitchen garden, where she was having a disagreement with the undergardener about the placement of the cold frames, which she was winning as comprehensively as she won all her arguments, which was to say, she did it so quietly and precisely that the other person often didn't realize they had lost until they were already agreeing with her. He asked her to come inside. They sat in the smaller sitting room. He told her about the letter. He told her everything, the cottage, the money, the legal provisions. He told her it was not much, but it was something, a place of her own, an income of her own, a life, if she wanted it, that was not this one. He told her that if she chose to go, he would not contest it. He would arrange whatever needed to be arranged. He would make sure it was done without difficulty. He looked at the fireplace while he said all of this. The fireplace was very clean, Mrs. Alderton was particular about fireplaces. Harriet was quiet for a moment. She said, "Is that what you want?" He said, "It's what's right." She said, "I know the difference." I asked which one you meant. He said, "It is the right thing, for you, to have the choice." She said, "I have the choice. I'm asking what you want." The fireplace. Very clean, very still. She reached out to the small table beside her chair and picked up the 3 books stacked there. A volume of botany, one of household management, one of poetry, in no particular order, and began stacking them, largest to smallest. Then she stopped. She put them back the way they had been, which was no particular order at all. She left her hand on top of the poetry book for a moment. She said, "I will need to think about it." He said, "Of course." He stood. He said she could take as long as she needed. He went back to the West Wing. He stood in his study for a long time, the way he had stood in October, in his coat, with the official letter. The shape of absence, the space where something was, or might be, or had almost been. He thought about the South Gallery, the farming almanac, the 63 years of household inventories, the laugh he had given her once, that small contained one, that she had looked up at and then looked away from. He thought about the way she moved through rooms, purposeful, contained, completely herself, never performing, never asking for anything she hadn't decided she was actually going to ask for. He thought about the apple trees, 47 varieties, and she was trying to find substitutes for the ones that no longer existed. The next morning she was at breakfast before him, which was unusual. He sat down. She poured tea for him, which was something they had fallen into without discussing it, one of the habits that had built up without announcement. She poured her own. He said, "I need to say something else." She looked at him. He said, "I've told you what was right. I haven't told you what I want. And I think that was a way of being careful, and I think you know it was, and I think you deserve better than a man who hides behind what's right to avoid saying what he means." She was very still. He said, "When Robert wrote that letter, I decided to come here and do what he asked because it was a thing I could do for him, the last one. And that was true. That was real. But I want you to know that it stopped being the reason sometime around November. Around the Northfield drainage. Possibly earlier. I haven't been entirely able to establish the exact moment, which is unlike me, because I am a very precise person, or I thought I was." He looked at the table. He said, "I'm not good at this. I'll say that plainly, because I think you'd prefer plain. The last 2 years, I've been a house with most of the lights off. I didn't notice until there were lights on again. And I was afraid, I have been afraid, specifically, that you were here because of obligation, and that if I said anything, I would be adding to the weight of it. I thought I was protecting you from that." He stopped. He picked up the small salt dish from the center of the table, put it down, 1 inch to the right of where it had been. He said, "I left that where it was wrong on purpose, so you would know that I had noticed. I didn't know if you would understand what I was trying to say with it. I hoped you would." Harriet looked at the salt dish, 1 inch wrong. Something moved in her face. Not breaking exactly, but opening, the way a window opens when the latch is finally turned on a day that's been airless. She said, "I understood." He said, "I want you to stay. Not because Robert asked. I want you to stay because this house is better with you in it, and I am better with you in it, and the kitchen garden is going to be genuinely extraordinary in 3 years, and I would like to be there for it. Those are my reasons. I know they're not particularly romantic reasons, but they're true, which is the best I can offer, and I thought you'd prefer true." She said, "I do prefer true." He said, "Then you know where I stand. Go or stay, but you should know that it will not be because I wanted you to go." Harriet Vane, Harriet Ashford, looked at the salt dish, 1 inch to the right of where it should be. She looked at him. He was looking at the table, not at her, with the careful, disciplined attention of a man who has said everything and is now waiting for the sentence. She reached out and took the salt dish, moved it back to the correct position, then she moved it 1 inch the other way, to the left. Wrong in the other direction. Left it there. He looked up. She said, "I knew why I said yes in Lincolnshire. I knew it wasn't because of Robert. Not really. Robert was the excuse. I needed an excuse, because wanting something felt dangerous, and having a reason for it felt safer. But I wanted it. I chose it. Even then, when I didn't know you at all, something in me chose it, and I've been very careful, these months, not to look at that directly, in case I was wrong about what it was. She looked at the salt dish, wrong in her direction. She said, "I'm not wrong about what it is." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "The kitchen garden is going to be extraordinary." She said, "I know." He said, "I'd like to be there." She said, "I know that too." They sat at the breakfast table in the February light, both of them with their tea, neither of them moving for a while. The house was quiet around them in the comfortable way of houses that have stopped being empty. The fire was going in the grate. Outside the window the kitchen garden sat under its frost, patient, already knowing what it would become in the spring. They did not, that morning, say the word that had been living in the house since November. They didn't need to. It knew where it slept. It had settled in weeks ago, quietly, without asking permission, the way the best things do. The solicitor's letter from Edinburgh was written 2 weeks later. It declined the bequest on the grounds that the relevant party was content with her present arrangements and wished the estate to be redirected in accordance with the next clause of the will. Edmund's secretary drafted it. Harriet added a sentence at the end in her own hand, thanking the solicitor for his diligence and wishing him well. She signed it as the Duchess of Crail. Spring came early that year. The cold frames went in. The first correspondence from Cornwall bore fruit in the form of 3 small apple trees of a variety not grown in Lincolnshire for 80 years, arrived in a crate packed with straw, which Harriet received at the kitchen garden door on a March morning with the expression of a person who has been given back something they thought was permanently lost. Edmund was there. He had happened to be in that part of the grounds, which he was doing more frequently these days, happening to be in various parts of the grounds where she also happened to be. He watched her lift one of the small trees out of the crate, examining it with her careful scientific eye, her hands in their garden gloves, the early March light thin and pale and honest on her face. He thought of Robert. He thought of the letter, the last thing Robert had done, not out of guilt or duty or the dying wish of a man who felt he owed a debt, but something more alive than that, more mischievous. Robert had always been good at seeing what other people missed. He had seen, apparently, something that neither of the people involved had been able to see themselves, and from somewhere in Portugal in the last months of his life he had made one final, precise, perfectly calibrated arrangement. Edmund would have been furious about it if it hadn't been the most Robert thing in the world. He would have been furious about it if it hadn't worked. Harriet set the small apple tree carefully in the barrow, looked up at him. She said, 47 varieties. I have 3, 44 to go. He said, how long? She said, years. He said, then we'd better start. She looked at him. That particular look, the one he had been learning to read since November, the one that was not quite a smile but contained all the warmth of one, compressed into something more private, meant only for the person standing close enough to see it. She handed him the barrow. He took it. They walked toward the orchard together in the thin March light, and the house stood behind them with all its windows and all its rooms, the east wing and the west wing, both of them now just parts of the same house, and the south gallery where the candles left shadows, and the breakfast table with the salt dish still 1 inch to the left of where it was supposed to be, and nowhere in the whole of it was a locked door or a painted shut window or a wall that didn't know it had already fallen. Robert Vane had known. He had always known. The letter was not a dying request. It was a last act of friendship. For both of them. For the sister who deflected with her shears and her ledgers and her scientific certainty, who had decided wanting things was dangerous and built her whole self around not needing. And for the friend who had spent 2 years with the lights off and called it virtue. Robert had seen them both, had counted the distance, had, from his deathbed in Portugal in October, with his unsteady hand and his thin brown one-eared dog outside his tent, closed it. Edmund found that out that spring, on a day when they were walking the east field, and he said something that made her laugh, not the small contained laugh he had first given her, but a real one, surprised out of her, brief and bright and entirely unguarded, and he stopped walking for a second. She stopped too. She said, "What?" He said, "Nothing. I was just thinking about Robert." She looked at the field for a moment. She said he'd be insufferable about this. He said yes. She said absolutely impossible. He said yes. He laughed. Not a small one. Not contained. A real one, full and sudden. The kind that comes up from somewhere you forgot you had. The kind that means something has unlocked and there is no point in locking it again because the key is gone. It lasted a moment. Then it settled. She was looking at him with that private warmth, and the field was green around them, and somewhere behind them the 3 small apple trees were already in the ground. 44 to go. Years, she had said. He had never been happier about the length of anything in his life. That's the full story. Just over 10,000 words, clean document prose, no headings. Let me know if you want any section deepened, the tone adjusted, or a second story built from another title.